Maisie first entered my life when I was 6. It was actually the day of my 6th birthday when she arrived in a brown cardboard box, sitting there on my doorstep. My birthday party had been mid-swing, with me and all my friends fully invested in our game of musical chairs, when the shrill ringing of the doorbell cut through our merriment. My mother left the room as the music continued and we raced around the chairs. Just as the playful tunes stopped and my bottom was firmly planted on one of the remaining chairs, I heard the front door closing as she made her way back into the living room with a cardboard box in hand and a confused expression on her face. "It's for you, dear. I'm not sure who it's from, though," she said, adding the box to the small pile of gifts that had started accumulating in the corner. The day went by, and after several party games and lashings of cake, it was finally time for me to open my presents. Sitting around in a circle, I opened each of the gifts my friends and family had bought me, thanking each of them in kind, until finally, I was left with that plain cardboard box. A peculiar gift, it bore a singular tag with my name as the only external decoration. It was in a handwriting that I didn't recognise, with no return address of any kind. No wrapping paper or ribbons, just a cardboard box with a thin plastic screen showing Maisie beneath. Her pale, porcelain face looked out at me through the cellophane barrier, her rosy cheeks and playful smile immediately captivating me. Ringlets of scarlet red hair lined her delicate face, slightly covering her large, kind-looking eyes. As I tore into the packaging and lifted her free, I could clearly see her smooth, almost translucent skin glimmering in the light as she moved. She was so detailed. It gave her face an almost lifelike quality, like whoever had painted her had tried to capture the very essence of a person. She was amazing. I looked around eagerly, ready to thank whoever it was who'd bought me this doll. But as I glanced over each of the faces in front of me, no one seemed to have a knowing look about them. Turning to my mother, she said tentatively, "Maybe it was a gift from old Mrs. Fairchild next door. She probably just forgot to write her name on the tag. You'll just have to go and say thank you afterwards." I looked back at the doll, taking in her beautiful appearance once again. A finely tailored blue dress wrapped her form, made of some kind of sumptuous fabric, either silk or satin. Delicate embroidery embellished its already extravagant appearance. Lace trims with tiny buttons and bows, all held together firmly with a large golden brooch on her right shoulder. Her delicate hands, peering from below the billowing sleeves of the dress, were made of the same exquisite porcelain as her face. Posed in a graceful manner, they'd been painted as though her fingers were adorned with dainty golden jewellery. I couldn't get over how beautiful she was, holding her there in front of me. I decided to call her Maisie. For the next few days, I would spend every waking moment with Maisie. We did everything together, from the usual things that a 6-year-old child would do with their new toy, like venturing to magical imaginary realms, to annoying my parents by playing hide and seek when it was time for bed, or pretending that Maisie was the one who'd stolen the biscuits from the cupboard. My parents didn't seem to mind though. I think they were just happy that I was so enamoured with my new toy. I introduced her to my family and friends as though she was a real person, going as far as making her do a pretend curtsy. I even introduced her to my pet hamster Gerard. Everyone thought she was amazing. They were especially in awe of the intricate details of her face. They all congratulated me on having such a brilliant new friend. Everything was perfect. That is, until a few days later. My mother had come with me to thank Mrs. Fairchild for sending Maisie over for my birthday. Standing outside of our neighbour's house and knocking on the door, I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the shuffling of old Mrs. Fairchild as she slowly made her way to the front door. "Ah, hello, my dears. What can I do for you?" she said as she opened the door, a large smile across her aged face. Although the ravages of time were slowly eating away at her, they'd done nothing to dampen her youthful spirit. Beaming, I shouted a massive, "Thank you, Mrs. Fairchild," as I held Maisie aloft. Her pleasant, wrinkled smile changed to a face of confusion as she looked in bewilderment at the doll. "Ah, that's a beautiful doll, dearie. And also a belated happy birthday to you for the other day. But thank you for what exactly?" My face dropped slightly as I gestured to Maisie. "For Maisie, for my birthday." "I'm sorry, my love, but I've never seen that doll in my life. I was going to ask you where you got it from. They were all the rage when I was a child. I've not seen one like that for years, though. She's absolutely beautiful. I bet children would have been fighting over her left, right, and centre back in my day," Mrs. Fairchild responded, that bewildered gaze still locked onto my doll. My mother looked down at me as I hugged Maisie, concerned. She proceeded to explain to Mrs. Fairchild about the box on the doorstep, and how there'd been no sender on the tag, so she thought it might have come from her. The old woman's face grew more and more confused and concerned as my mother explained the story, before apologising and again reiterating that this was the first time she'd ever seen Maisie. As we left Mrs. Fairchild's front door, my mother leaned over to me and whispered that it probably was Mrs. Fairchild who'd sent Maisie, but she'd probably just forgotten. It wouldn't have been the first time. With her advancing age, her memory was quickly fading. I wanted to believe her, but there was something about that encounter that didn't sit right with me. Most of my relatives had been at the party that day, and my mother had called the few that weren't, as well as a few of my friends' parents. None of them had claimed to have sent the doll, which had only cemented our belief that it was Mrs. Fairchild. But seeing the look on her face, the baffled expression as I told her about Maisie, I could tell she genuinely meant what she'd said. She'd never seen that doll in her life. Looking back down to Maisie, I couldn't help the cold feeling of unease worming its way into the back of my mind. As the days went on, I found myself playing with Maisie less and less. That oddly nauseous feeling bubbled in my stomach each time I looked at her, along with that image of Mrs. Fairchild's bemused face. I'd placed Maisie on my bed, facing towards the door as I opted to play with some of my other birthday presents instead. One particular morning, I was playing with a Harry Potter Lego set that my aunt had bought for me. It was a scene with Harry facing off against the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, as Tom Riddle watched from the sidelines and forks flew overhead. One of my favourite parts of the film. I was just sticking Harry's hair onto the minifigure when I couldn't help but notice something about Maisie that got under my skin a little. It was just a small thing. Probably just my imagination. But there was something about her eyes. I'd never noticed it before. Not in all the time we'd spent playing together over those past few days. But I swear today, they seemed to follow me around the room. I turned back around after hours of playing to find her glassy brown eyes fixed on me, her head still facing the door just as I'd left it. The way she seemed to look at me, they felt cold, almost curious. A chill ran through me as I looked into those glassy orbs. It was as though she was studying me with a detached fascination. I knew it was silly, that I was probably just imagining it. She looked like an old doll, so the glue that bound her eyes in place was probably just coming loose, giving the illusion that her eyes were following me. But it still creeped me out enough to put her in her own chair at the end of the room that night, rather than letting her sleep in my bed with me. I knew that I was overreacting, that she was just a doll. But the strange eye movements, coupled with the fact that we'd still not found out who sent her, ate away at my mind. I turned her to face a wardrobe before climbing into bed, placing my now complete Harry Potter Lego set on my bedside table. My mother soon came to tuck me in, commenting on the fact that Maisie was on the other side of the room rather than in my bed with me. I explained what I'd seen, that Maisie had stared at me all afternoon, but my mother just chuckled to herself, putting it down to my childish imagination, before wishing me good night as she left the room and turned out the light. In the now darkness, I could make out the silhouette of Maisie facing away from me towards the wardrobe. I couldn't help the creeping chill along my skin as I imagined her head turning to face me the instant I closed my eyes. That clinical, fascinated stare fixing itself on me. I pulled the covers tighter to me, covering my head and wishing that sleep would come. After what felt like an eternity, tiredness overtook me, and I slipped into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, I awoke to the sunlight seeping in through my open curtains. Surveying the room, it was just as I'd left it the night before, only the curtains had been spread wide open. I assume my mother must have come in and opened them at some point that morning in an attempt to get me to wake up. Propping myself up and rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I looked out in the direction of the window. Maisie's chair sat between me and the pane on the other side. A soft sigh escaped my lips as I half expected her to be staring at me again, with that unnerving glassy stare. But she was still there, propped in the chair with her eyes fixed on the wardrobe, just as I'd left her. Pushing myself into a sitting position, and swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, I slid my feet onto the floor, ready for another jam-packed day of playing, when a white-hot agony buried itself into my heel. I screamed out, yanking my foot back and holding back the tears welling up in my eyes, as the burning pain radiated out in throbbing bursts. Snapping my gaze to its source, a singular black Lego brick had embedded itself in my foot, leaving a lasting imprint as I gingerly pulled it out. Looking down at the floor, my heart sank as the scattered Lego bricks coated the majority of the carpet. Darting my eyes to my bedside table, the dawning realization hit me. My Lego set was nowhere to be seen. The remnants of the basilisk and its chamber lay scattered around the floor of my room. I was devastated. I'd spent hours building that set, and it was the first one I'd done all on my own, without any help from my parents. I'd actually been really proud of it. How could this have happened? I could have knocked it off the bedside table in my sleep, perhaps. But if that was the case, I would have expected to have been woken by the crashing of tiny, shattering bricks. Also, if I had indeed knocked it off, then I would have expected the bricks to have formed a nice little mound as they smashed, with maybe a few scattering further out, but the majority remaining pretty much together. But the bricks were all over my floor, much wider spread than seemed possible for a fall, and more evenly distributed too. It almost looked deliberate. As my eyes swept the scene of the devastation, they couldn't help but be drawn to Maisie. A fleeting, childish thought filled my brain. She could have done this. Was she jealous that I'd snubbed her for the Lego set yesterday afternoon, and then forced her to sleep in that chair rather than my bed? I shook it off like the childish idea that it was. She was just a doll. Sure, she unnerved me a little, but she was just porcelain and fabric. No, this was something else. was about to turn towards my parents' room, and demand to know if they'd somehow been involved with this, when something made me stop dead in my tracks. Maisie's chair sat between me and the door, static in the middle of the room. But as I stared at her, I could swear that a part of her had moved. Maisie's foot was jutting out at an odd angle. Not the same one that I'd left it in the night before. Or at least I was pretty sure that it wasn't the same. I could have sworn that I'd placed her neatly in the seat, arms resting on her lap and feet facing towards the wardrobe. Although I didn't want her in my bed with me, I still wanted her to look presentable. Now she was sat there in almost the same position, but her right foot was jutting out slightly, facing towards the window rather than the wardrobe door. My mind began racing. Had Maisie done this? Had she somehow gotten up and walked across the room? It was sounding more and more far-fetched the more and more I thought about it. But to my 6-year-old mind, it was the only thing that made sense. I didn't even consider the possibility that my mother could have accidentally knocked Maisie's foot as she left my room last night. Or that, if indeed it was my parents who had destroyed my Lego set for whatever reason, they could have perhaps knocked her foot during the act of scattering the bricks. I made my way out of my room, tracing a large circle around Maisie, not taking my eyes from her until I was safely out in the hallway. I shivered as I imagined her glassy smooth eyes staring at me through the closed door as I made my way along to my parents' room. Knocking on the door, I was greeted by the haggard face of my mother, whom I'd probably just torn from the embrace of sleep. Explaining about the Lego set, and how it had been there when I went to bed and in pieces when I woke up, the bemused look that sat across her face made it clear that she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. With a yawn, she followed me back to my room, assessing the carnage in the Lego bricks that now covered the floor. "Are you sure you didn't just knock it over in your sleep, honey? You might have caught it with your arm or something," she said in a half-awake daze. "No, I couldn't have. Someone broke it. There had to have been someone in my room last night. They broke my Lego and knocked Maisie's foot as they walked past." My voice trailed off as my eyes drifted back to Maisie, and I noticed, with a cold shock, that there was nothing out of place. Both of her feet were facing the wardrobe door, exactly where I'd placed them before going to sleep. "You okay, honey?" my mother asked as I stared in shock at Maisie. No. Maisie. Her foot wasn't where I left it. Someone had knocked her. She'd been moved. But now she's back where I left her. "I swear I saw it," I managed to mutter as waves of confusion crashed over me. I just couldn't figure out what had happened. Maisie's foot had been moved. I saw it. I knew I wasn't asleep as I'd gone to fetch my mother straight after. There's no way I could have dreamt it. But there was no way that her foot could have been moved back either. No one had been in my room in the few seconds between me leaving and me and my mother entering, and Maisie couldn't move it herself. As I stood there, eyes still fixed on Maisie, I was vaguely aware of my mother mentioning something about my imagination, and that she could help me rebuild the Lego set if I wanted, before the door slowly closed behind her as she made her way to the bathroom. An eerie feeling crawled across me as I stood there. Just what the hell was happening? Maisie's cold, glassy eyes were fixed dead ahead, but I could have sworn that, just for a moment, I saw something in them. Something almost triumphant, before they returned to their dead, shimmering state. The way she sat there with the light reflecting on the cool porcelain of her face seemed to give her once pleasant smile a sinister edge. I turned away as unease welled up in me, unsure of exactly what to think anymore. I just tried my best to push the strange sights of the morning out of my mind. To that end, I went about my usual routine, getting my clothes from the wardrobe and getting myself ready. Although I had my back to her, I couldn't help but feel Maisie's gaze on me as I made my way around the room. The thought of her dead, glazed eyes watching my every move caused my skin to crawl, and I spun around, expecting to catch those lifeless eyes tracking me. To my relief, Maisie was still staring at the wardrobe, unmoving. Still, this whole thing was beginning to get to me. Just looking at her sitting there was enough to cause my scalp to tighten. Although I knew that I was probably just overreacting or imagining things, I couldn't help but feel like there was something wrong with her. Stepping up to her chair, I grabbed Maisie and carried her over to the wardrobe, placing her neatly inside before closing the door. At least if she was in there, then she couldn't watch me as I played. Although I swore that I could still feel her eyes on me even from behind the wooden doors as I left my bedroom. The next couple of days seemed to pass as normal, and I tried my best to forget about Maisie. However, every morning when I went in to retrieve my clothes, I would be met with a pale, smiling face and shiny, glassy eyes staring at me from the darkness. Each time I'd have to bite back my unease, quickly grabbing my clothes and shutting the door again. After the third time that this happened, I decided to cover Maisie with an old coat, tossing it over her haphazardly. Even though I knew she was still there, it at least meant that I wouldn't have to look at her each time I opened the door. I spent the rest of the day playing with my action figures. My favourite was my Harry Potter figure that I'd been given as a Christmas present a few months prior. We'd been on several adventures together since then. I think that particular morning, we were spies on a secret mission in a hostile country. Using Harry's magic and the spy kit I'd been given by one of my friends for my birthday, we'd successfully infiltrated the foreign government's headquarters and were trying to hack into their computer systems to download the files we needed, while Harry used his spells to make sure that no one detected us. We were there for hours, sneaking along my bedroom floor and diving across my bed until my mother shouted up to me that dinner was ready. After dinner, I played with Harry some more, finally finishing our mission before it was time to go to bed. My mother came in as I got ready, tidying away some of the other toys that littered my floor. Still clutching Harry in my hand, I clambered into bed and covered myself with the duvet. My mother kissed me goodnight and turned out the lights as my eyelids became heavy. I tossed and turned all night that night, trapped in the throes of a nightmare. I don't remember much of it, mainly just the sounds. I could have sworn that I'd heard the tinkling of china gently tapping against wood, and a heavy dragging sound accompanied by the soft singing and laughter of a young girl. It was unnerving enough to etch itself into my memory, even now. I remember waking with a start, cold sweat beading on my forehead. The light from the edges of the curtain seeped in, dimly illuminating my bedroom. The sounds of the nightmare ebbed away as I realised with relief where I was. As I relaxed, it took me a few seconds to register as my vision was blurred with sleep, but there was something resting on my pillow in front of me. The pinkish white shape sat perfectly placed there, a few inches away from my face, obscured by my still weary eyes. Gently rubbing away the sleep, I jumped back with a start and screamed as the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was a head. Harry's head. Sitting there on my pillow. It had been completely torn away, His decapitated body, with sharp plastic shards sticking out from the rough tears around his neck, was still firmly grasped in my hand. I screamed again, terrified as to what I was seeing. How the hell had this happened? How could anyone have done this to Harry? I was holding him when I went to sleep, and I was still holding him now. How had someone managed to tear his head off? Looking back at the jagged plastic of his neck, I couldn't help but feel the malice that this must have been done with. The pure hatred that whoever had torn his head from his shoulders must have felt as they chaotically ripped away at him. It terrified me. The fact that all of this had happened, and I'd just slept right through the entire thing. My mother burst through the door, panicked eyes darting frantically around the room as she responded to my terrified yells. "What is it, honey? Are you okay?" she asked, still scouring every inch of the room for something wrong. I couldn't speak. All words had left me. All I could do was hold up the remains of Harry for my mother to see. "Oh, honey, what happened to him?" she said, making her way over to me and hugging me, her eyes visibly calmer now that there was no immediate danger. I explained about my nightmare, explained the sounds and how I'd woken up with his face inches from mine, his body still in my hand. A sad expression played across her face as I relayed what had happened. She knew Harry was my favourite action figure, and could tell that it had deeply upset me. Maintaining the hug, she agreed with me that it was strange and tried to comfort me. "Oh, sweetie, it's okay. We can try and stick him back together. Maybe his neck had just started to weaken from being played with, and last night was all it took. You probably just rolled on him, and that was the last straw. It's okay though, we'll sort it." I appreciated her trying to make me feel better, but I could tell she wasn't sure herself. Her voice sounded apprehensive as she stroked my hair and held me tight. Besides, that explanation didn't add up in my head. The jagged plastic of his neck didn't look like it had been snapped or been crushed as I rolled over it. It looked torn and slashed aggressively. And then there was the head. To leave his head on my pillow like that, there was no way that could have happened by accident. It was a message, a warning of some kind. It had to be. It was too meticulously placed, too perfect to have happened by accident. We sat there hugging for a few more moments before my mother released her grip, telling me that she needed to go and start breakfast and that I should get ready for school, but that she would try and fix Harry when I got back. With that, she got up and left, leaving the door ajar behind her. Shoulders slumped and tears lining my eyes, I slid from the end of my bed, making my way towards the wardrobe to get my school uniform. Reaching out my hand, I was inches away from the handle when I stopped dead. The door was ajar. Goose pimples broke out across my arms as I stared at the blackness beyond the crack in the frame. I swear I closed it last night after I got my pajamas out. I was certain. But it was right there in front of me, partially open. Alarm bells rang in my head the longer I stared into the darkness. Had whatever had done this to Harry hidden in there, or been hiding there in the first place? After all, people always talk about there being monsters in your closet. Gingerly, I reached out and gripped the door, gently pulling, wincing in anticipation of the thing hiding on the other side, ready to jump out at me. The door swung open easily as it always did, and revealed nothing. Just the same clothes dangling from their coat hangers above the folded piles of underwear and socks. It was the same as it had been every other day. Now even more confused, I couldn't understand what was going on. What had done that to Harry? And why was the door open? More importantly, where had whatever had done it gone? As I stood staring at the open wardrobe, the glint of something shiny caught my eye, coming from the lower left-hand corner. Casting my gaze downwards, I noticed a glimmering porcelain jutting from underneath an old coat. Maisie. Slowly peeling back the coat, dread washed over me as those glassy, lifeless eyes met mine. She was still lying where I'd left her, but I swear she was propped at a different angle. My mind began spiraling again. She'd moved. She had to have moved. She'd done this to Harry. She had to have. Maybe she was jealous that I'd played with him after she'd been thrown in the wardrobe and forgotten. Either way, she had to have moved. The thought that I could have knocked her as I'd taken my clothes out of the wardrobe didn't occur to me until later that day. I couldn't help the tremble in my throat as I stared down at the pale porcelain doll before me. There was something wrong with Maisie. Something deeply wrong. My mind replayed the events over and over in my head, jumping to conclusions left and right. The first time something like this had happened was the first day I'd not had Maisie in my bed with me. I'd put her in that chair at the end of the room after talking to Mrs. Fairchild. Then the morning after, my Lego set had been shattered. Now I'd spent the day playing with my Harry figure, and the morning after he'd been decapitated. Could Maisie have been jealous that I'd been playing with other toys instead of her? I caught myself mid-reel, chastising myself for getting so wound up. What was I talking about? Maisie was just a doll. Sure, she creeped me out a little now that I had no idea where she came from. And sure, I thought her eyes followed me sometimes. But she was still just a doll. Someone else had to be doing this. Someone real. Trying to shake the feeling as best I could, I got ready for school and went downstairs. School was an eventful that day. I could hardly concentrate on my lessons. I was so fixated on the growing problem that seemed to be affecting my playthings. I needed to find out who it was that was coming into my room each night and destroying my toys before there were none left. Sure, it had only happened to 2 so far, but that was 2 more than it had ever happened to before now, and I couldn't see a reason for either. As my teacher was droning on at the front of the class, scribbling away at the whiteboard about something to do with how crystals form within rocks, the makings of an idea hatched in my mind. Whoever was doing this to my toys came out at night while I was asleep. They were quiet, but not completely careful. They'd knocked Maisie's foot one time and left the wardrobe door open another. Both times I'd heard nothing, but they'd definitely been there. I needed to see them while I slept. For my birthday, my grandparents had given me a cheap smartphone. It was my first phone, and even though I didn't have any of the flashy features of a more expensive phone, I didn't even have a SIM card to make calls, I thought it was brilliant. But even with its lack of fancy features, it still had a camera. If I could set it up before bed, and position it in such a way that it could see all of my room, then I'd be able to catch whoever was doing this in the act. It was foolproof. As soon as I got home, I ran straight to my room and checked the phone's camera, testing a few trial recordings to try and find the best angle. I finally decided on the corner of my room, near my bedside table. The picture was clear enough that I could make out pretty much all of my room with ease, and there were hardly any blind spots. Happy with myself and the fact that my plan was in motion, I spent the rest of the afternoon playing with Gerard. I'd placed him in his ball so that he could run around my room, his excited squeaks intensifying as he charged along the length of the rug and bounced along the laminate beneath. I even made him a small obstacle course using my school books and some of my toys. It filled me with joy watching him clamber over action figures and dolls in his clear plastic ball, and I even laughed out loud as I watched him attempt to climb a particularly steep book that I'd actually intended for him to roll down instead. Watching the small, squeaking ball of fluff charging around the room at breakneck speeds helped me to calm down and forget about the events of the morning. After what had only felt like a few minutes of playing with my pet, my mother called from the hall to let me know that tea was ready. Scooping Gerard up and putting him back in his cage, I refilled his food and water before heading downstairs. Soon enough it was time for bed, and time for me to put the rest of my plan into action. I got dressed into my pyjamas as normal, doing my best to ignore the lump under the old coat in my wardrobe. As I clambered into bed, my mother entered the room to tuck me in. She kissed me goodnight as she usually did, calling me her little angel before turning out the light and closing the door. As soon as her footsteps faded across the landing, I sat up and got to my feet. My heart beat rapidly like a drum with anticipation as I set up the phone like I'd practiced and made sure the camera was working. Once I was happy with its placement, I pressed record and quickly got myself back into bed. Surveying the room one final time for anything out of the ordinary, everything looked as it should have, and I rested my head on the pillow, trying my best to sleep. Although it took a while, I think because I was excited about finally catching whoever this was, I slowly faded into unconsciousness, the shapes of my room slowly being replaced by the darkness of my dreams. Again, a nightmare gripped me. Flashes of terrifying creatures in the dark mist, sounds of tinkling china and heavy dragging, and a wet, squelching sound that made me feel sick. The deep unease and fear tore through me as the sounds whirled around, faster and faster. The bright light of my room greeted me again as my eyes snapped open, those awful dreams now clearing. Taking a few seconds to come to my senses, I glanced around the room excitedly, awaiting whatever destruction had occurred the previous night. As I surveyed the space, my heart sank. The room was exactly the same as it was the night before, not a single thing out of place. Disheartened, I slipped out of bed and picked up the phone from the corner. Stopping the recording, I held it there in my hand. Although it was obvious that the perpetrator hadn't visited me last night, I felt a compulsion to check the video. I knew it would just be a recording of me lying there for 8 hours, but at least I could check out the angle and make sure that it was working as I needed it to. Skimming through the video, I saw myself dimly lit by the glow of the landing light, climbing back into bed and tossing around a couple of times before ultimately settling. Nothing much happened after that, and I skimmed through the rest of it. Gerard came down from the top of his cage and started running around in his wheel and playing with his cardboard tube. But otherwise, the room was still. As good as the angle and the recording were, the more I watched, the more my disappointment grew. That is, until the timer showed 3 a.m. As I watched on, a slight movement on the screen caught my eye. I froze as my blood ran cold, and I nearly dropped the phone. The wardrobe door was opening. It was a gentle, slow movement, but the door was definitely moving. From the glowing darkness beyond, something shiny and pale reflected the dim light of the hallway. I felt the colour drain from my face as a dainty porcelain hand pushed against the other side of the door. As the gap between the wardrobe and the door steadily widened, The glassy eyes and glazed face of Maisie slowly leered out of the darkness. My mind reeled. She was moving. Maisie was moving on her own. With what looked to be great effort, she stood precariously on her delicate porcelain legs, dropping from the wardrobe and standing there on the carpet. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Maisie was standing at the foot of the wardrobe, her head jerking on its own as she appeared to survey my room. Standing in place, her head and limbs twitched and spasmed violently, as though she was having great trouble controlling them. Seemingly satisfied that the coast was clear, with a quivering step, she began walking across the room, the sounds of tinkling china accompanying her every footfall. Although she was an elegant doll, her walk was laboured, a lurching, shambling walk. She seemed to stumble and trip, although never quite toppling over. One of her smooth porcelain feet dragged limply across the floor behind her as she forced herself onwards. My stomach writhed as I watched her gradually make her way over to my bed. My still form was softly breathing, fast asleep, as she came to a halt just before me. Standing there for several seconds, staring down at me as she twitched and spasmed, she seemed to hesitate, before slowly moving again. Reaching out a shaky porcelain hand, she gently stroked my hair. Disgusted, my hand reached up to touch my hair as bile rose in my throat. I felt sick at the idea of her watching me, at the fact that she touched me as I slept. Although her back was to the camera, I could see that her head was cocked at an odd angle. Just like her walking, her arm movements were harsh and clunky, with no semblance of fluidity. She stroked my hair gently enough not to wake me, her quivering hand moving slowly back and forth. The way she moved, it was with the same care and compassion that someone would stroke a much-loved pet. All the while the rest of her was twitching violently, struggling to maintain control as though her body was unfamiliar to her. Watching this back was awful enough, but then she turned around, and I had to cover my mouth to stifle a scream. The beautiful, painted smile that covered Maisie's face had contorted into a malevolent grin, with rows of tiny razor-sharp teeth glinting from behind it. Heavy black cracks now lined her ashen-grey skin, no longer gleaming and delicate. Her glassy eyes were nearly black, faded and dull. Trails of a thick black liquid leaked from them, pooling just above her cheeks. Her terrifying visage seemed to quiver and shake, snapping and twisting as those lifeless glassy eyes continued to scan the room. It was as though she was searching for something, scouring every inch of the space before her. And then her eyes locked onto Gerard, who, up until this point, had been running around in his wheel. With an unsettling, struggling lurch, she dragged herself across my bedroom, her glassy eyes fixed on Gerard. As she made her clumsy approach, a cold trickle worked its way down my spine as I watched her face begin to split. It started as a small tear in her nose. It seemed to gradually widen as she walked, the porcelain around it pulling back to reveal the raw flesh and sinew underneath. Peeling away from her top lip all the way to her forehead, her skin flapped open, and her once pretty face now revealed a large gaping chasm of razor-sharp teeth leading into a dark pit. All I could do was stand there, my hands shaking as I watched her on the feed, getting closer and closer to Gerard's cage before coming to a stop just before it, her glassy eyes tracking the every move of my poor pet. She seemed to stand there for what felt like an eternity, twitching and spasming as she watched Gerard unsuspectingly running in his wheel, unaware of the petrifying creature watching him from just inches away. Time seemed to stand still, The twitching of Maisie and the running of Gerard the only indicators that the video hadn't frozen in place. Then I jumped with a start, as Maisie's arm suddenly burst forward into a flurry of uncoordinated movement. She reached out her tiny ashen hand, ripping the cage door from its hinges and crushing the metal in a singular motion. Gerard, startled by the sound, turned to see the terrifying face before him and let out a gut-wrenching squeal. Frantically charging to the far reaches of his cage, I watched as he attempted to desperately bury himself beneath his bedding in a blind panic. Almost autonomously, Maisie thrust her hand into the cage, throwing sawdust and seeds left and right as she chased the horrified Gerard around the cage, before finally trapping him in the far corner. Gerard screamed in protest as tiny porcelain fingers wrapped themselves around him, desperately trying in vain to bite the hand that restrained him as he was torn from the cage. He was clumsily raised into the air and held there before Maisie's face for a few seconds, while her eyes seemed to study him, full of contempt, before being shoved brutally into that abyss of horrid fangs. No sooner than Gerard was inside the flaps of her face, they began to close up again like some kind of grotesque Venus flytrap, stifling his panicked squeals until there was nothing but a wet crunching sound. I retched as I watched Gerard disappear, vomit working its way along my throat as Maisie's face knitted itself back together, returning to the horrific visage that it had been mere moments ago. And like that, the carnage was over. The missing cage door the only indication that anything had ever happened. Tears burned as they welled up in my eyes. Maisie had killed Gerard, killed my friend. I was certain now she'd been the one who killed Harry in my Lego set too. I knew there was something wrong with her, something unnatural. But why? Why was she doing this? And what did she want? A twitching jerk from my phone screen caused a cold hand to tug at my scalp. Maisie had whirled around, violently spinning her whole body until she was facing the camera, her glassy, lifeless eyes staring directly into the lens. Directly at me. I watched, paralysed, as she dragged herself over to where the camera was perched. All the while she stared directly into the lens, dragging herself closer and closer, bringing that horrific, lifeless face so close that it became the only thing that I could see. Still covered in that black substance that leaked from her eyes, and still showing those rows of now blood-covered razor-sharp teeth, she stood there. She didn't move, standing as still as she could as she stared, twitching into the camera lens. I flicked through the video, fast-forwarding it, watching through hours of footage in a few seconds. All that the screen showed was her unsettling, dead eyes boring into me through the camera. She stayed like that, twitching and staring, until the sun came up and movement from my bed seemed to snap her attention away. As soon as she noticed me stirring, she violently span on her heel before jerkily making her way back across the room. As she clambered back into the wardrobe, I could see her tiny porcelain fingers wrapping themselves around the door, pulling it closed as far as she could. The fingers slowly retracted back into the darkness as I watched myself sit up in bed and rub the sleep from my eyes. I dropped the phone onto my bed, numb, not quite able to believe what I was seeing. Maisie was alive. Not just alive. Alive and dangerous. I felt sick as the full weight of what I'd seen crashed down over me. I'd been in the same room as that thing for days now. I'd even let it sleep in the same bed as me. Terrified, I scanned the room again, hoping that what I'd seen on the phone moments ago was just a sick dream. My stomach dropped as I looked over to Gerard's cage. The door had been completely torn away, and lay crumpled on the floor below it. The open cage was completely devoid of any life or movement. The tears that had welled up in my eyes slowly began to slither down my cheeks as I turned my gaze to the wardrobe, and another frigid wave washed over me. Sure enough, the door was ajar. A tiny gap between the wood and the frame. My mind was going a mile a minute as the realization that it was all real hit me. There was something evil in my wardrobe, and I was sitting in the room with it. Swiping my phone from my bed and trying to keep my wardrobe in my peripheral vision, I ran to my parents' room. I needed to show someone the video. I needed an adult. I didn't know what to do. Bursting into my parents' room, tears streamed down my face as I tried to relate everything I'd seen on the phone. It must have sounded like a garbled mess of sound, as my mother scooped me up into a hug and stroked my hair in an attempt to calm me down. After a few seconds, she asked me to try again, concern etched into her face. Between sobs, I tried to explain what I'd seen on the phone, about Maisie and Gerard. Still perplexed as to what had gotten me into such a state, my mother took the phone from my outstretched hand before sitting back down next to my father. I watched through blurry eyes as they watched the footage. Their expressions changed from confused to amazed, and then into a horrified grimace as the macabre clip unfolded before them. A stunned silence settled over them as the video finished. They were well and truly baffled. After what felt like several minutes, my father turned to face me, asking what the hell that was. I tried to explain that it was what I'd filmed last night after I'd gone to sleep, that I'd left the camera recording, but he didn't believe me. There's no way you recorded that. Look, I know you're old enough to have this phone now, but you need to be careful what you do with it. There are lots of apps that can change videos, and you've obviously managed to download a horror-themed one or something. It's not real, but just be careful which sites you're going on. My heart sank as his words hit my ears and my limbs felt heavy. They didn't believe me. They thought the video was fake. I knew it had to be real. There's no way I'd accidentally downloaded something. I'd only set the camera up and pressed record. And then there was the wardrobe door being ajar. And Gerard's cage. Gerard's cage. The door had been ripped off. I'd seen that for myself this morning. What about the door for Gerard's cage? When I woke up this morning, it had come off and was lying on the floor, just like in the video. And I can't find Gerard anywhere, I said, a sob catching in my throat. Are you sure you closed it properly when you put him in last night? If he'd managed to open the door, it wouldn't surprise me if it snapped under his weight as he climbed out. It's only thin metal. He's probably somewhere in your room. Give me a few minutes to get dressed and get some breakfast, and I'll help you look for him. The tears came back in heavy, racking sobs at my father's insistence that nothing was wrong. I ran out of my room, crying, much to the bemusement of my confused parents. If they weren't going to do something about Maisie, then I would have to. She'd killed Gerard, destroyed Harry, and trashed my Lego set. She was escalating, and I had no idea where it would stop. What if she decided to do something to my parents next? Charging into my room, I stopped dead outside of my wardrobe. It seemed to tower over me, the ajar door filling me with dread as I imagined the split face of Maisie staring on the other side, just waiting for me to wrap my fingers around the wood. Still, I needed to do this. I had to. Tearing open the door as fast as I could, and half expecting something cold and smooth to grab my hand the second it touched it, relief washed over me as I was met with the empty space of my wardrobe. It was just as I'd left it, the hanging clothes and piles of underwear and socks still just as I'd placed them. The ruffled old coat sat there on the bottom left of my wardrobe, although it looked as though it had been recently moved. A cold pit opened up in my stomach. I knew Maisie was under there, buried and hiding, pretending as though nothing had happened last night. Gingerly, I reached out a hand, ready to jerk it back at the slightest sign of any movement. Grabbing the coat as lightly as I could, I slowly pulled it away, steeling myself for the terrifying visage of Maisie beneath. My jaw dropped as the coat fell to the floor, revealing the gleaming porcelain face of Maisie, no longer ashen and marred. She looked exactly as I remembered her, all except for the position that she was now placed in. Once again, it had changed and assisted. Stamping down the revulsion that crawled through me as I touched her skin, I grabbed her by a porcelain ankle and tore her from the wardrobe, running as fast as I could to the front door. All the while I was pushing down the nausea rising in my throat. Ripping the front door open, I ran to the end of our drive, flinging open the bin lid and hurling Maisie inside. Slamming the lid closed again, I jumped on top and sat, holding it in place with my weight. There was no way she was getting out of there. It was Sunday morning, and the bin hadn't been emptied when I'd thrown her in, so all I had to do was wait. It wouldn't be long until the bin men made their rounds, and then this nightmare would be over. I sat there for what felt like hours in my pyjamas, half expecting the bin to jerk and clatter underneath me. With the rumbling of every engine, my heart soared, only to drop again as a regular car would speed by. Passers-by looked at me in confusion as they made their way along the street, but I paid them no mind. I needed to stop Maisie from getting out before the bin men could take her. Just as I was beginning to give up hope, wondering if the bin collection had perhaps been cancelled this week, the heavy rumblings of a diesel engine broke through the hustle and bustle of the street. That sound was like glorious music to my ears, and sure enough, the bin lorry made its way into view, steadily working its way up my street. "Hi there, mind if I take that? Wouldn't want you getting mixed up with it," said one of the bin men, approaching with a smile as he gestured to the bin. I slid from the top of the lid and thanked him, retreating to the front of my house and staring at the truck. As my bin was raised into the air, I watched with a pounding heart as its contents were swallowed by the mechanical jaws of the crushing mechanism. I could make out a small, white, porcelain hand jutting out from the mound of refuse before it was buried by another dump of rubbish from my neighbour's bin. As the truck began to pull away, a serene sense of relief washed over me when the sounds of the crunching scoop and crusher activating reached my ears. It was over. There was no way anything could have survived being in the back of that truck. Maisie was gone. What remained of her would be taken to a landfill somewhere and never seen again. Slinking back inside, the weight of what had happened crashed down on me. Gerard's terrified squeal as he was thrust inside that gaping chasm of teeth echoed around in my head constantly. I couldn't believe that I'd been sleeping in the same room as that thing all this time. I felt sick as I remembered the way she stroked my hair as I slept. I wish my mum had never brought her inside. If she'd have just left her on the doorstep, then none of this would have happened. And I still had no idea who sent her. The rest of the day went on as normally as it could. The thoughts of Maisie eventually quieted down as I distracted myself with the rest of my toys, now safe in the knowledge that I wouldn't wake up to find them destroyed tomorrow. After finishing his breakfast, my father set about the task of searching my bedroom for Gerard. I'm pretty sure he scoured every inch of the room, even moving the furniture. But he found no sign of my poor pet. I knew it was futile, that Gerard was gone. But my father was convinced that he'd managed to escape the room and was probably hiding somewhere deeper in the house. I'm not sure that we'll be able to find him today, sweetie. But if we keep our eyes peeled, we might be able to see where he's hiding. Don't worry, I'm sure he'll turn up, he said after about an hour, finally admitting defeat. The day passed me by in a blur, and soon enough my mother told me that I should start getting ready for bed. Getting myself ready, the wardrobe no longer instilled a sense of dread as I opened it to get my pyjamas. There was no lump in the bottom left corner. The old coat that had been covering Maisie was now hung up with the rest of my clothes. Clambering into bed again, that same relief from this morning washed over me as I surveyed my room, happy that I would wake up with no broken toys, or something even worse, the next morning. I'd finally figured it out. Even if my parents didn't believe me, I'd still managed to fix it on my own. Although it had meant that Gerard had paid the ultimate price. That night, as sleep took me, a familiar nightmare took hold. The sounds of tinkling china and a young girl's eerie laughter woke me with a start. Darkness clouded my vision. As I took a second to adjust to my surroundings, I was still in my bed, still in my bedroom. But it must have been the middle of the night. The only light was the dim light from the hall and a thin beam of moonlight seeping in from the narrow crack in the curtains. I sat there, shaking off the unease of the nightmare, when I heard it. A sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. 3 gentle knocks echoed through the silence of my room, and my skin broke out in goosebumps. I could have sworn that sound had come from my window. A gentle rapping. I sat there for what felt like minutes, holding my breath and waiting, my heart pounding in my ears. Then it came again, slightly louder this time, more insistent. 3 slow knocks, as though something out there was asking to be let in. Terror washed over me as I realized I hadn't imagined it, and it hadn't been a byproduct of my nightmare. There was something out there. Gingerly, and against the screaming protests of my rational brain, I edged my way across the darkness of my room until I was inches away from my window. The knocks came again, cutting through me as they sounded, even louder than before, like a stone hitting glass. Although I knew it was probably nothing, that there was probably a perfectly innocent explanation for that incessant sound, I still had to bite back my unease as I stood there before the curtains. I knew I should have just gone back to bed, ignored the sound and checked in the morning. But a part of me needed to know what it was. After all that had happened, I needed to prove to myself that everything was fine. With a trembling hand, I reached out and took a hold of the thick fabric, slowly peeling it back to reveal the glass pane. As the moonlight flooded in through the now obscured window, I screamed at the silhouette standing on the ledge outside. Clearly visible in the bright moonlight, the glassy, dead eyes of Maisie locked onto mine. She looked exactly the same as she had done yesterday before I threw her into the bin. Immaculate and beautiful. All except her face. Her mouth had warped into something akin to a sad grimace, and the betrayal in her eyes was palpable. As I stood there, screaming, she pulled back her hand in a jerking motion before slowly smashing it against the glass of the window 3 times. all the while keeping me in her unnerving gaze. Flinging the curtains closed, I ran from my room, screaming. Maisie had found me. How had she found a way back from the refuse centre? The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I imagined what would happen if she got in, what she would do to me. That look of betrayal in her eyes was still burned firmly into my vision. I burst into my parents' room, tears streaming down my face, startling them both from sleep. It took them a few seconds to come around, and I could tell from their voices that they were irritated with me, but I didn't care. Frantically, I told them about what I'd seen, about Maisie knocking at my window. Although they listened to me, they both assumed I'd had a nightmare. If it hadn't been for my unwavering insistence that I'd seen Maisie standing outside my window, regardless of any argument that they put forward, I don't think my father would have gone to check it out. I watched as he left the room and walked the short distance down the hall to mine, my heart hammering in my ears all the while. What happened if Maisie had gotten in? What if she attacked him? I waited for what felt like an eternity, my ears pricked for the slightest sound that anything was wrong, as I heard my father pull back the curtains and look out of the window. A few seconds later, his heavy footsteps returning along the hall met my ears, as he made his way back into his room. He'd found nothing, just my regular, empty window. No sign of anything having been there at all. My heart sank. I knew what I'd seen. Maisie had been there, knocking for me to let her in. She'd made her way back here, and now she was here for me. I burst into tears again, curling into a ball on the carpet of my parents' floor. They let me sleep in their bed that night. I think it was because they could see how distressed I was, even if they did think it was just a nightmare. The tapping on my window returned the next night, and every night after that for the next 2 years. As the days went on, and I tried my best to ignore it, it was accompanied by the quiet, sing-song voice of a young girl asking for me to open the window. I tried everything, from putting cooking oil on the window ledge outside to make it slippery, to blocking off my window with cardboard boxes. But still, she was unrelenting. After 2 years of that, it was getting to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. I was so close to giving up when a ray of hope came in the form of my dad getting a new job. It was a massive promotion, but it meant that he'd be relocated to another part of the country. We had to move. I had nothing to base it on, but I hoped against hope that Maisie wouldn't be able to follow us that far. Sure, she'd made it back to my house after the bin lorry took her, but that would have been a tiny journey in comparison. I eagerly counted down the days until we moved, doing my best to ignore Maisie's nightly visits until the day finally arrived. The moving truck was packed full to bursting with boxes, and our car was filled with the remainder. Our entire lives packed into 2 vehicles. As I clipped my seatbelt in and turned back for one final look at our old house, the blood in my veins turned to ice. Maisie was lying there on the floor, directly beneath my bedroom window. She was facing me, her glassy eyes fixed on mine. They drilled into me, the hatred behind them burning into me from across the driveway. As we pulled away, I watched in horror as they followed me, not breaking contact until we turned the corner and the house vanished in our rearview mirror. That was the last time I saw Maisie, and I'm glad to say I've not heard from her in the years since then, although the sight of porcelain dolls still sets me on edge. I don't know what happened to her, but I wouldn't be surprised if she's still out there, trying to latch on to some other unsuspecting child. Hey guys, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really appreciate each and every one of you watching. If you enjoyed this story, please feel free to check out my other videos for more original horror content. Also, I've released a full-length novel based on my That Church is Abandoned for a Reason story. It's available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. I've popped a link in the description. Check it out if you enjoyed my work. Thanks again for listening. Until our next descent into the darkness, remember, it's never just a story.